we talk about youth advocacy, a lot of times students are advocating for themselves, but other times it's the adults in their lives that are also doing advocating for them. And what advocacy can look like if we're not careful is control. And it can look like things like we're telling them how to live, who they're supposed to be, what they're allowed to be, instead of empowering them to speak for themselves. And so what I want to go through today, it's funny because like what I get really interested in is history. Because what I really bothers me a lot of times is sometimes when we think about the world and how we've inherited the world, we think of history as the things that happened long time ago in the past. And like now that history has happened, we just have to do whatever is set out before us. And what I always try to remind people is that history is an ongoing process. And history is something that is still happening and something that we get to decide how it turns out. And so my hope for what we talk about today, for this session, workshop, whatever you want to call it, is that we're able to identify what has happened, especially when we're talking about student-led movements, specifically in the United States. So 2 of the ones I'm going to talk about today are Nashville specific. 2 are from other places in the United States. And I just want us to be able to identify ourselves in those moments and use those moments to understand where we are right now and where we have to go. So just to introduce myself, my name is Stephen Watts. So today I'm representing Black Mental Health Village. So Black Mental Health Village is an organization that is focused specifically on centering the experiences of those who have been most marginalized and have inherited generational trauma. Because when we talk about generational trauma, what we are really saying is that those things that happened a long time ago still live in our bodies, they still live in our systems, and we're interacting with them every single day. And not just because as a people, right, people who have experienced generational trauma are flawed, but because our systems are flawed. And so we're constantly re-exposed to those same things. And so it's about being able to use that trauma actually as a learning experience, right? That sounds weird. Whenever we talk about trauma as a negative thing normally. But when I talk about trauma, I talk about trauma as an exposure experience, as something that helps us to recognize more about the world that we live in, usually about danger. It takes away the fantasies that we lived in usually those fantasies are around safety, right? And it tells us this is the world that we actually live in. And then the question that trauma always asks us, now what do you want to do with it, right? So with Black Mental Health Village, I'm the Youth Advocacy and Safety Manager, right? Youth Advocacy and Safety Manager. And so when we talk about safety in a world where so many of our kids are unsafe, that can create some kind of paradox or contradictions. So when I talk about safety, right, I'm not out there with a gun, I'm not out there actively, intervening in these kinds of things. When I talk about safety, I'm really talking about helping students understand how to create emotional safety within themselves so that they can know who they are, how important they are, how special they are, so that they can speak up for themselves. And speaking up for yourself, that doesn't always mean using your voice. It doesn't always mean being mad. It doesn't always mean yelling. Sometimes using your voice can mean walking away, right? So what I mean is I always want students to be able to show up for themselves as themselves. So I look at these things as advocacy and safety as intertwined, because when you advocate for your safety, and when you feel safe, you are able to show up in a way that honors you and who you want to be. So I'm going to start with a quote. I'm just going to read it out loud. So this is kind of a weird quote to start with. So this is written by someone named C.S. Lewis. So basically he was like an old white Christian man, right? And those are things, except for the man part, that I don't personally identify as. But when I read this book and it changed my life. And this book is called Screwtape Letters. And it is a book that is written he writes it from the perspective of a demon, right? If you're having trouble with that word, demon, then just think of anything that tries to distract you from something that is true or important. Anything that tries to stop you from doing your work. And so this is from the perspective of that distraction, right? It says, while they are young, and they're talking about humans, while humans are young, we find them always shooting off at a tangent. The incalculable winds of fantasy and music and poetry, the mere face of a girl, the song of a bird, or the sight of a horizon are always blowing our whole structure away. They will not apply themselves steadily to worldly advancement, prudent connections, and the policy of safety first. A great human philosopher nearly let our secret out when he said that where virtue is concerned, experience is the mother of illusion. So I could easily just go ahead and explain that quote, but I'm interested to see if any of y'all have any ideas of what that means or anything like that. And if not, I'll go ahead and explain what it means to me and why I decided to start with this. So the reason why I decided to start with this quote is I think it's really powerful to say. So this is, remember, this is written from the perspective of something that's constantly trying to stop people from doing their work. And it's saying, when people are old, when people have experience, people think that the world that they've inherited is real and cannot be changed, right? They're always doing the smart thing. They're always doing whatever protects their reputation. They're always doing whatever protects their station in life. They're doing what protects their money. They're doing what protects their status. And what they're saying is, wow, we're so lucky that people don't understand that experience is what protects illusion, right? Experience is the mother of illusion. Because what they're saying is, youth is the thing that is most dangerous to distraction. Youth is the thing that is most dangerous to illusion. Because when you're young, right, you see all these things and you say, why not, right? Youth is just like able to be, our young people are able to imagine, they're able to question, they're able to not take things that so seriously, they're able to bounce back. They have all these kinds of like forms of resilience that a lot of us don't have. And so just these things, whether it's like a random song that plays and they're, you know, whether it's, you know, a pretty picture, and it's just that ability to notice that not everything is so serious, right? The ability to say, the world shouldn't be like this. Those things are the things that are most dangerous to the things that are trying to stop us from doing our work. And so it's for that reason that youth advocacy is so important. Because what we're about to see, so we're going to look at 4 different examples from US history. And what you will see is what has always happened is young people see that something is wrong in the world. Young people say this shouldn't be happening. The adults who swore to protect them say yes it should because it protects me, right? We don't care that it doesn't protect you, but it protects me. And so it's that youth that allows us to look through those illusions. And it's that experience, oftentimes, too often, that makes us want to protect those illusions because it benefits us. So the first one I'm going to start with is Ruby Bridges. Raise your hand if you think you know her story pretty well. So I'm not going to go too much into her story, so I'll just say, this is about school integration, specifically in New Orleans. So in 1954, a Supreme Court ruling came down called Brown versus Board of Education. A lot of us have heard of it. And Brown versus Board of Education said that school segregation is no longer allowed by the law. Basically what they found was, they said that school segregation makes people, specifically black people, think that they are inferior because that's not true. School segregation poses a danger to the mental health and psychology of our young people. What immediately followed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards, is just extreme backlash to people who were thought that school segregation was very important. Is there anything interesting you noticed about these pictures that I put up? You raise your hand, bud? Yeah.
The word nigger.
Yeah. Why did you think that was important to point out?
Because they used to call black people that back in the old days.
Yeah. And including little girls. Yep. It wasn't just reserved for like adults, they would call anyone that. Yeah. Yeah, they had to protect her because people had threatened to kill her. Yeah. A little girl for going to school in a place, being in a place that they didn't want her to be. Anybody else? Anybody think anything is interesting about this picture? And why did you think that's interesting? Yep. One is a photograph and one is a painting. And I'll share a little bit more in a bit why I thought that was important to show both. Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
One of the things I think is interesting is that she's not, it doesn't look like she's walking with anyone that's familiar with her. So like where are her parents or family members or why is she, I know she was going to attend school, but why is she having to step into this new transition with no one that she's familiar with?
Right? She's protected, but she's also still kind of alone.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, like you can see that this little girl still feels the weight of this moment. Even if she can't contextualize or name it, she still feels that weight. One of the things, so I'm gonna go back to why I decided to put both a photograph and art up, is the art on the right side is oftentimes the picture that I have seen, right? I've seen it only represented as art. And the reason why it's been so important for people to represent these things as art is because otherwise it wouldn't be represented, or otherwise it wouldn't be represented well, or in a way that is meaningful, right? So that picture on the left, what I thought was really interesting, normally when you see pictures from the 1960s, they're in black and white, right? But this one is in color. And I thought it was really important to put it in color. And this is the first time I've ever seen this picture in color. I've always seen it in black and white. And one of the reasons, that I've become aware that we put old pictures in black and white instead of in color is to create historical distance between ourselves and that moment, right? So if we saw these pictures in color, we're able to recognize this isn't that long ago at all, right? Ruby Bridges is my mom's age. This is the system of that my mom and my dad grew up under. And I think it's really important to remember that. My dad is super, super light-skinned, and every time I joke with him about it, he's like, look at my birth certificate, I was born in a Negro hospital. He's always trying to contextualize that moment for me to understand that we are right there. We think of these things as such a long time ago, but we are literally right up against kissing that moment. And when we think about that, it makes that moment seem a lot different if we see that picture in color versus if we see that picture in black and white. What black and white does, it kind of sanitizes the moment. It allows us to feel that distance from it, no responsibility, and it lets us forget that there's a good chance that everyone in that photograph is still alive. So one of the questions I have, and I'm just gonna open it up to y'all, is when you think about where we are right now in history, especially when we're thinking about student movement, student needs, student advocacy, where are we?
like we are currently in a very important part of the history books. I already knew after COVID that this was going to be something that was definitely going to be talked about, like the flu was, but kind of bigger actually. But with how massive the shootings are, and how dangerous school's becoming, the fact that we are sending kindergartners to school with bulletproof backpacks. That started at Walmart when I was going school shopping, and that actually blew my mind. It's becoming to a point to where this is gonna be a whole chapter in the history books in the next 30, 50 years. And it's gonna show like how kind of backtracking we are in safety and in history, because I felt safer I did, and my cousins that are older than me, before COVID than we did after, physically and medically.
No, the only thing I'll push back is I think this next 4 years might be a whole chapter, right? Not just the next 30. Anybody else? Where are we in history? Does anyone want to kind of answer that question based on any of your thoughts? Where are we right now?
It says that people perish for lack of knowledge, and I think, if we're not in tune in what's going on, like some things are going to start repeating themselves. That's just my personal take on it.
And just to let you know, this presentation will get political because that's my job. So don't feel any need to say this is not a space where you can represent yourself how you want, but it will get political. So I think that's really important. Why I always say, where are we in history? Because it's important to identify ourselves as active makers and creators of history, not just receivers of it. When we're able to identify ourselves in our moment of history, Bailey, I like what you said, you're like, 30 years from now, this is gonna be on the textbooks, right? And the question is gonna be, what did you do? Right? It's not just gonna be, wow, this is so interesting. It's gonna be like, oh, what side were you on, right? What changes did you make? What did you say? What did you feel? All those questions. And it's interesting because when I ask my parents those questions, it's depending on what moment I'm talking about, it's really hard for them to answer that question. They can answer what they did. They can't really answer what they felt, because that's not just things that they were taught to be aware of. And so these are the kinds of things when I'm talking to students about advocacy, it's like, no, I don't want to just know what you did or what you want to do. I also want to know what you felt. I want to know why you did that. I want to know why you didn't do that. All of those things. And those are the things that, it's going to be really important to be aware of and to work on cataloging. This is a Nashville-specific moment that I wanted to talk about. So the woman in the middle, her name is Diane Nash. Can you raise your hand if you have heard of Diane Nash? Cool. So in the 1960s, well, really the 1950s, there was an organization called SNCC, so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And a lot of their work was headquartered out of Nashville. So if you're thinking about, the civil rights movement, one of the things you won't really, I didn't know about the civil rights movement is the civil rights movement was really headquartered in Nashville. So when you think about all the things like desegregation of restaurant counters, when you think about all those things, that was here. That was in Nashville, and those were all students. Those were all students who, there was, one very famous professor who trained a lot of them, but a lot of them had to disobey their professors. They had to disobey a lot more than professors. So a really cool story is, I got to meet Diane Nash. I got to meet her when I was in college. And I was in college organizing around some racial justice stuff at school. I went to a really tough, racially charged, that's the best way I can put it. I went to a really racist place. And it was a really hard experience. And when I was advocating for some of that stuff, I got to meet Diane Nash. And one of the, the things I asked her, so she told me a story about she's in a room with, so on the left, that's an actor named Harry Belafonte. She was in a room with him, she was in a room with Martin Luther King Jr., she was in a room with John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy says this thing, and he goes, she had a really adversarial relationship with John F. Kennedy. So in the 1950s, or 1959, 1960, there was the thing called the Freedom Rides. So a Supreme Court decision had come down and had said that interstate travel had to be desegregated. And so what these students from Nashville decided was, well, let's see if it's true. So what they did is they hopped on these buses, and they hopped on these buses heading down to Alabama, and they said, well, let's see if they actually let us get on these buses and ride them. And some folks had gotten on buses from Chicago and New York earlier, and they had gotten almost beaten to death. And so what the folks from Nashville did is they these students, they wrote these letters that said, well, if I die, like, Mom, I love you, Dad, I love you. They wrote them, put them in envelopes, and then they got on their bus. And John F. Kennedy, who was, he was the president at the time, he's calling them frantically. This is before cell phones, but he's still he's calling their professors, calling whoever he can call. And he's like, you have to stop these people. And Diane Nash is like, no. It's up to the federal government to decide to protect the laws, not up to me as a student to be threatened by you out of following what is my right to get on this bus and to be protected. So 2 years later, 1963, she's in a room with John F. Kennedy again, and John F. Kennedy goes, listen, you did so well with the Freedom Bus rides, and what I want you to know is SNCC is an organization that has has so much respect from me, and so what I want to do is I want to make SNCC part of the Democratic Party. And every year I'll give y'all 8 delegates so that y'all can decide who's going to become the next president nominee of the Democratic Party. You can have 8 of the delegates out of the 100. And I asked Diane Nash, I was like, what did you say? And she goes, I told him no. I was like, what? And she was like, yeah, I told him no. I told him, if it's such a great idea, why didn't you think of it yourself? And I was like, you said that to the president? You weren't nervous? She was like, no, child. The only person I was nervous around was Harry Belafonte because he was so handsome. And for me, that was just an awesome moment to understand. Not only will students be constantly told what to do and what not to do, but the most powerful people in the world are invested in what you do and what you don't do, even as they try to make you feel unimportant. So they try to make you feel unimportant at the same moment that they know that you have the power to change the world in a way that is not beneficial to them. And the reason why John F. Kennedy was trying to stop her from getting on those freedom rides was not because he was anti-integration. He was anti-integration that was not on his terms. He was anti-integration that might threaten his political career. He was anti-integration that was happening on a timeline that his allies were not comfortable with. And so all of those things that people try to stop you from or tell you to do at a certain time, they're just not your concern. What's your concern is to do your job. So I have a question, right? So that's a story of something that happened here. And that happened here specifically because of some of the possibilities available in Nashville. And when I think about what is available in Nashville specifically, then there are 5 HBCUs within a 2-mile radius of each other. So all of these young people who were promised this future and being denied it were able to join together and say, no, I'm not gonna take it anymore. So I'm just curious, any of y'all, what are some of the possibilities right now that are available in Nashville specifically?
I would say the first thing that came to my mind is with the the Nashville Community Review Board, what they're trying to do for the students in Nashville, for the kids and teens and stuff in Nashville.
Yeah, can you say more why that's so special?
I would say that's more special. Well, I would say that that's special because not a lot of kids' voices are heard. And even today with the panel and with all the different discussions and stuff, I felt way more like my voice and what I had to say was heard today. I felt like I had somebody listening, even if it was a room full of 100 people. I feel like at least one person was listening. So I do feel like that's very important, and that is more important because kids nowadays don't feel heard. They just feel swept under the rug, everything is just pushed aside. So I do feel like what they're trying to create is good and it's going to be beneficial and it's going to make it somewhere.
And I agree, and I think one of the things that's specifically so special about that project is when the state made police oversight illegal, Nashville was still able to find a way to have some sort of police accountability. And it's not oversight, but the fact that this thing is able to coexist shows some of the contradictions and creates that tension. That means that something else is going to have to be created. So to be within a state where the police oversight is illegal, and then to have an organization in a city that's committed to some form of accountability, I think that's really special, and that's Nashville specific.
I also say just leaning on the foundation in Nashville, being agent of change for the nation. And anytime that we've ever had any change, it's always been people from 15 to 21 years old who changed views and who just went against what they've seen. And so if we're going to have a change, it's going to be those people who are going to make it.
It's always been the students, and it's always been the South, right? Because the South is the place where the contradictions are most clear, right? Between this idea of freedom and then being denied it. I'm gonna go to one last one. Let's talk about this, because this is also Nashville specific, and I think this is important. So I'm just gonna talk about it briefly, and then I'm just gonna go to one last slide. So in the 1950s, there were 3 Nashville civil rights bombings. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of them? Or if you're somewhat familiar with those? Okay. So off the top of my head, right, so I'll talk about the first one, which was in 1954. So there was the bombing of a civil rights lawyer, which was Z. Alexander Luby, which was in 1960. There was the bombing of the Jewish Community Center, which was either 1958 or 1957. But in 1954, they bombed an elementary school directly after Brown versus Board of Education. And that was in Nashville. And it's interesting to me because Nashville has all this civil rights history, has been, the mother of the civil rights movement, been the mother of what I'll call white racial resistance to things like integration or other things like we're just talking about, like in Tennessee, like banning police accountability. And that was specifically after Memphis Police Department beat a black man to death on camera. And that was why they banned police police oversight. We're talking about all of these things that have happened in Nashville, and yet so many of us don't know about them. And then that begs this last question that I'll ask before I go to this last slide is, if so many of us haven't been taught this history. So my question here, you can take any of these questions I'm about to ask, which is, what is it that you want to learn? Why haven't we been taught this history? Why is it important to be taught this history? Any of those questions I just want to throw out to the audience, especially as it relates to you as students or folks who work with students. Why is this history important? Why hasn't it been taught? All of those questions.
Do you feel like this history is like not put in like schools because?
Do you feel like this history is not put in schools because, like, I guess I could say the government, but I would say just anybody in general really doesn't want people to know the actual history, like to know what happened. Like, do you feel like this isn't, learned? Like, when we learn about history in high school, it's about like 7-Eleven and like, what was that, 9/11? So I don't think about the gas station, but 9/11. And so do you feel like this is like not put out there, especially because it is based off of more like African Americans that have did a lot of like change?
What do you think?
I do. I think that it's not taught as much as everything else. Like I don't think that we learn like we dibble and dabble about like segregation and slavery, and we learn here and there about it, but I don't really feel like it's taught like on a deeper level. In middle school, a teacher told me that she didn't like teaching Black history because it was too violent, and that's why she wouldn't teach it in her class. And first of all, the audacity to actually say that to my face is insanity, that you refuse to teach it just because it's too violent. And that shows a lot of what I've learned is the history that I've learned in the Black community and what we've accomplished, I've learned through books, through reading on my own, or what my mother or father has taught me. I haven't learned anything in school, really. And it's a cover-up of the history books, trying to erase what has been done and making it seem nicer, because it's like the perspective, US is the place you want to be. You want to move to US, it's the country, it's the land of the free, but only if you're white and rich. And that is what I've been taught. And we need more people in the community who will teach in these nice schools and are able to actually tell what happened in history and kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty, even if it isn't quite enjoyable, because it's sometimes aggressive, because that's how we've been treated throughout history, is with violence.
Yeah. Okay. Most of what I would say I have been taught is from the source. I say that in saying my grandmother participated in woolworks in the sit-ins, and I'd like to make it known that she still goes on runs. She can still run, and she participated in something that's considered that long ago. And so I feel I've been taught about that, and I've also been taught mostly from my mother. My mother likes to research things and learn things that aren't taught in schools. I think it's really concerning that, a lot of people learn about 9/11, like Nyla said, but not a lot of my friends, and mostly my peers that go to my school, practically none of them know about the Black Wall Street bombing. And they didn't know it was a thing. They didn't know what it was. and it's just not taught. And to go to back off your point, which is your question was, do you think that they do it because what did you say?
They don't basically want like the African American race to know.
Yeah, I would say that, but I would also say I don't think that they want to be seen as oppressors. You know, when we think about how some people speak about terrorist organizations, how they talk about ISIS, Hamas, these terrorist organizations, some of them wouldn't even call the KKK a terrorist organization. So some people do not have, they don't want to see themselves as an oppressor, and they won't call themselves the oppressor. And I think that that's something that we have to work past to unveil the truth.
Sorry. I also feel like they want to dial down, like, I guess I would say, like, the smarts of the African American race. Like, I feel like people want to to have this image that African American people, brown people, are just not as smart and don't have enough money like white people do.
So I know it's my time, so I'm gonna wrap this up, but I'm gonna respond I think one of the important things is that history is context. And when you take away context, all you have is responsibility. So that means that if you are poor, it's your fault. That means if you are harmed or you are scared or you have PTSD, it's your fault. It means if someone is rich, it's their fault, whatever the opposite of fault is. They earned it, right? If they have this or they don't have that, right? They earned it. And so I think one of the things about the American Project, when we think about history and what history is context, people don't want to be able to identify themselves in history because there's a lot of pain associated with that. So, and I just want to say, I didn't pick these examples randomly just to talk about history. I specifically want to talk about schools. And I want to talk about how schools are sites of resistance. I specifically took a picture of an elementary school being bombed because that was a place it was so scary that to an entire generation that people might be together in this shared space and be able to know their neighbor and be able to see the other person as human, that they decided that they would rather get rid of it, right? As a community, that they would rather get rid of it than have that structure exist. Not many, I don't know how many people know this, but Nashville had the longest integration injunction by the Supreme Court in history. It was only raised in 2010. In 2010, Nashville had to reach an agreement with the federal government to get the segregation injunction lifted, not because they had achieved integration, but just because they had to reach some kind of plea deal. So when we're talking about history and where we are, I just want us to remember we're very much in the thick of it, of deciding what's next. So the last thing I'm gonna leave this on is just kind of this slide. And I just want, if you all recognize any of these movements, these student-led movements, I want you to just call them out. And I'll kind of just say what each of them are, if any of them aren't named. What do y'all see? What do y'all recognize? Say it again.
Palestine?
Yep. And one of the reasons I made sure to put up the Palestine one is because in Tennessee we didn't really have protests like that. One of the reasons we didn't have protests like that is because we have something called an anti-camping law that both makes it a felony to be homeless on public land, which of course public land is just land that we own. Is any land that's not private, so if you're homeless, it's public land. And it also makes it illegal to do protests like the ones that we saw across the country. So it's an anti-protest and an anti-homeless law. Anybody else, do y'all recognize anything from these student-led movements?
Gun violence. I want to get to gun
Yeah, March for Our Lives. Yep, that's a really important one. To Tennessee 3, another one against gun violence that was right here. Yep. Some other ones from history I pulled out. So there's the one, Stop Apartheid, South Africa. So that was a nationwide one that was really led by students on college campuses who were telling their campuses to disinvest from apartheid South Africa. And that's on the bottom right. And the bottom left, that's from the Kent State Massacre. So that was an anti-Vietnam War protest where the military showed up and killed college students on campus. On the middle is 1923 Fisk University. This is an interesting one. I'll just leave it. I'll drop it right here. But in 1923, so Fisk University, the president of Fisk at that time, so that's a HBCU in Nashville for those of y'all who don't know, wanted to increase the money that they were receiving from funders, specifically from funders who supported Jim Crow, so who supported segregation. Because, you know, according to the president's thinking at the time, he was like, well, like, we're an HBCU, like, you know, we can still get money from, like, we're an all-black institution, we can still get money from, you know, pro-segregation forces, and we can, as long as we control our students from stopping protesting Jim Crow and segregation. And basically what the students did is they took over a building. They occupied a building and demanded that he got fired. And so that's an interesting tidbit of Nashville. And for, you know, Nashville has such a deep history of student protests. The reason why we don't know it, right? I love what you said, like, what we don't know about like a school bombing that happened in our city, but we know more about like the Confederates, you know, about Robert E. Lee than we know about, you know, actual, you know, like, than we know about school bombings here. It's just about what history is convenient, what history is important. And so I guess my advice to y'all and like my encouragement to all of y'all is just to continue to be curious, ask questions. I love what you said about go to the source, go to your grandmas, get this history, ask, where were you? You know, what were you thinking? You know, sometimes they won't always be able to answer. You will be surprised how many people I've asked and they were like, I wasn't paying attention, like I just didn't know. And I'll just be like, well, that's a lie, you know? And just being able to know that people's, you know, either their apathy or their ignorance or their not being able to notice that the thing that everyone was talking about at that time, which was desegregation, you know, if they say that they don't know, that means that they knew and they were quiet. You know, just being able to identify those things because these people are still with us. And more importantly, like we're still with us and we're still in this moment of deciding what's next. That's really all I have. I don't know if I'm supposed to take questions, but that's all I have. Thank y'all.